This is a Labour Lives interview, and I'm in the constituents' offices of Jess Phillips MP. Thank you for agreeing to speak to Labour Lives.
It's my pleasure.
I wonder if we can talk about some of your own background. It's on record that you're just obviously elected as MP for Birmingham Yardley, and I wondered if you could tell me something about where you come from and your background generally.
Well, I come from Birmingham. I grew up in the King's Heath area of Birmingham, but all of my family originate from Birmingham Yardley. So my father is from Sheldon. My mother was from Yardley proper, as she used to call it, and so I've lived in Birmingham pretty much my entire adult and all my childhood and all my adult life.
You have said that you got back involved in politics because of the 2010 election, the coalition election.
Yeah.
And that prior to that, you were looking after your children and had a full-time job as well. And 2010, you became more energised about politics.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been energised by politics. I come from an extremely political family. It was never a day would go by in my childhood when we wouldn't discuss the news of the day, the politics of the day. My parents, the committee room for elections would be in my parents' house. My grandfather, who lived with me from when I was 3 till I was 16 when he died, he was exceptionally active in both sort of local and national politics. He was a draftsman by trade, but he was also an amazing artist, and he was a political cartoonist and he used to help people like Tony Benn with his literature, and Jeremy Corbyn, in fact, it turns out, for sort of left-wing magazines and things, he would do political cartoons, and he really was one of the people who brought me up as well as my parents, because they were both at work. So yeah, I've always had a really political life, but I suppose under the Labour government of 97 to 2010, my fight and everybody's fight waned a little bit because we weren't fighting, I suppose, is one of the reasons. We'd won, we were in government, and prior to the Iraq war, the activity I'd known all my childhood in the Labour Party dipped. There wasn't the same level of anger and fight, and we were always working for it because we had won. So I think we just sort of rested on our laurels a little bit for a little while. And then obviously during the Iraq war, my parents both left the Labour Party, and I also left the Labour Party. I don't remember making the active choice to leave the Labour Party. I imagine my parents were paying my subs from when I was 14, and when they stopped, I stopped. And I was at university at the time and having my children almost immediately after I finished university. So it wasn't that I wasn't politically aware or politically engaged. It was more just the fight had gone, and I'm a person who quite likes a fight. And I'd started to. I've always voted Labour, but yeah, I wasn't particularly politically active in that period. But then when the 2010 election happened, I think at the same time, my children were of sort of an age where I wasn't having to be with them constantly. So I'd started to take part again in sort of community activism locally to where I live. And at that very moment as well, the Tories won and the fight comes back, and they're all the same, isn't everybody looking the same? We quickly realised that they didn't look the same, and they weren't the same, and so never to be a person to sit back out of the fray. I got back involved in politics in 2000. I rejoined the Labour Party in 2010. It coincided with the leadership election in 2010, and I wanted to have a say. Like many people have done recently, I joined to have my say. It was another thing that spurred me on to do it.
I see. So, in terms of what you were doing locally. You talk, I think, and have talked extensively about a campaign local to you, which was the, if I can say, the sort of the spur, and perhaps got you noticed.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly what got me noticed by the Labour Party itself, because I didn't go to Labour Party meetings or anything. I didn't go to my CLP meetings or branch meetings or until, probably about 2011. But my activity, I had rejoined the Labour Party, and the activity that I was doing seemed as well to be the sort of thing that the Labour Party were talking about at the time, community campaigning, that sort of thing. And so when they send out those endless emails that the Labour Party loves to send out about people getting involved and doing stuff, it seemed to be talking directly to me, the kind of people who are trying to help clean up their local area or rebuild a community centre or doing those sorts of things. That was what they were looking for. So when I put my name forward, they to go on the Future Candidates programme, which they were running at the time. Obviously, I think that the activity I had been involved with locally in trying to help my street get over some quite serious arson attacks over a period of months got me noticed by the Labour Party, yeah.
They certainly got you noticed because they then made a video about you.
They did. They did make a video about me. So that was after it. That was to encourage more community activism in the Labour Party, and rather than the idea of having sort of career politicians, it was the Labour Party was very much making a specific drive to try and get people who were, I suppose, worker ants in communities to stand as representatives. So yeah, they asked me to make a video about how I had gone from being a community busybody, for want of a better word, to being a sort of somebody who puts themselves forward for elections. And yeah, they made a video about me.
I was interested in that video because it chimes in with two other pieces of information that come out. Well, first of all, in that, you make reference to a friend of yours saying that you said that you were thinking about becoming a councillor, and she then said something along the effects of, "Oh, well, you're going to be Prime Minister then."
Yes, she did. My friend Alex.
Right. Well, Alex doesn't seem to have been the only one who has said that, because in a Huffington Post interview online with you, you also said that as a young child, your ambition was to be Prime Minister.
Definitely, it was, yeah.
Right. And then, of course, which may not have been seen by many people, but is online, there is an interview with Julie Birchall, which I'll come to later on, perhaps, in which, of course, she describes you as potentially the next leader of the Labour Party, or a future leader.
Yeah, I was going to say next leader, I think, might be stretching it, but yeah, she I think it's more a hope of Julie Birchall's that I might be the leader of the Labour Party, rather than anything based on any concrete activity. But yeah, it will inevitably, it's a very recent piece, in fact it's only been actually published today. It was published online yesterday, but the actual publication comes out today in The Spectator. But I imagine it sets hairs running when people say those things about you, whether you intend them to or not. But yeah, I mean,
but you don't.
I wouldn't rule it out.
Okay, well, let's take you back to the first election that you have, which is for the Longbridge ward, way back in 2012. You win that election, and fairly soon on you become the victims champion for Birmingham.
Within about 2 weeks, I think, a week.
That presumably is part of the fact that you have considerable experience of dealing with victims of domestic violence and other matters, a subject which many years ago was swept under the carpet but is now hopefully more open and people are a bit more aware of it. How did you get into that particular field and job?
I was raised by a radical feminist and have always, being the youngest of 3 brothers, and being the only girl, I think that I was raised by my mum to always think about women's issues, always fight for women's equality, always told that I could be anything that I wanted to be and I shouldn't let them, be seen as being the ones who would be successful. I had a strong sense that I wanted to work with women, vulnerable women, and so I just applied for some jobs, and and I got a job in a it was sort of slightly clerical role, quite not not a big management role. I got quite a clerical role at Sandwell Women's Aid, and then I just worked my way up.
So when you were then, if you like, becoming the councillor for Longbridge, you were then the manager of this particular organisation at that stage?
No, I was never the ultimate manager. A woman called Sarah Ward was and is still the manager and one of the greatest inspirations of my life. But I was one of the senior management team. I think, yes, probably by the time I became elected, I was a member of the senior management team. So it was only about 18 months, 2 years after I'd started there. Not even that long, maybe, about 18 months.
How did you juggle then that job, which was obviously a pressured job? You've talked about dealing with people with blood all over them in a speech to the House of Commons, people who've been victims of domestic violence and goodness knows what. How did you manage to do that job and then take on the role of being a councillor, and then in a very early stage as a very newbie in terms of the council house, become this victims champion? Well, so that seems to me to be taking on quite a big leap.
Well, I've always been a person who takes on an awful lot of work. I don't, the only thing I think I have in common with Margaret Thatcher is that I don't sleep very much, and I don't need to sleep very much. So there's a lot of hours in the day for me to work. But the victims champion role was almost completely cohesive with my role at Sandwell Women's Aid, because my role at Sandwell Women's Aid very much became about West Midlands wide strategy around domestic violence, sexual violence, child sexual exploitation and human trafficking. So I was, a lot of the meetings I was going to previously were the same meetings I would have to go to as Sandwell Women's Aid. So I got to be both, in some regards, the commissioned service and have that understanding, but also then gain the understanding of being a commissioner, and I think that was interesting. So the crossover in the victim services thing made actually some of the work I had to do much easier. I had an amazing member of the council staff, a woman called Lavaine Hanley, who was the support staff member for the Victims Champion role, and she was amazing. And whilst the person you see is me always, it is the people who sit behind you who often don't get any of the credit but deserve so much of it for how well they do all the, what the sort of nuts and bolts work. So the victim's role didn't add much. Being a local councillor and the meetings you have to go to, the casework you have to do, a lot of it is in the evening, so you could fit it in. But also, as I said earlier, one of my greatest inspirations in my life and in my career is the woman Sarah Ward, who ran Sandwell Women's Aid not only for the victims of that service but for the betterment of women everywhere. And she very much believed, as a woman who only employed women, and she had a workforce of nearly 60 by the time I left, if not more actually, around up to about 80 by the time I left. She knew that those women being looked after and pushed and encouraged would make the cause better, and the idea of me having the victims champion role and me pushing to be in Parliament, she felt that was as much part of the role of Sandwell Women's Aid to make that happen for the betterment of victims of domestic violence in the long run. and I would never have been able to achieve what I have achieved without the support of the staff at Samwell Women's Aid, because they offered me total flexibility. I could work from home, work at night. It wasn't like I was, I was ever pressured when I couldn't be there.
Well, I mean, that is interesting because, of course, with that particular role that you had, the senior management role, you then go into the council and you take on the victims champion role. But also there were other people, other women who'd been perhaps maybe just been elected before you or whatever, who were taking up cabinet roles and things like that.
Bridget?
Did you ever think of being a cabinet
No,
officer,
I never.
or were you invited ever?
No, it doesn't work like that. You're elected to be a cabinet member. No, I was never invited or asked or ever put myself forward for any, I suppose, what you'd call payroll position on the council. The victims champion role was completely voluntary. It was voluntary in the sense that it's not a paid position. No, I didn't, because I didn't want to leave my job, and that would have been too much. It was incredibly hard to leave my job when I was elected, but I'd had 2 years to prepare for it. But I wasn't interested in being a full-time councillor, which, if you are a cabinet member, actually, really, it's a full-time job. And I think very few people do it with another job alongside that is anywhere near full-time. And I wasn't willing to do that because I loved my job and I thought it had real opportunities to change people's lives.
Why are you still the councillor for Longbridge?
Mainly because the cost to the taxpayer of a by-election after I won the election seemed grossly... I mean, these things cost a ridiculous amount of money, who knew? And I felt that rather than forcing an election, I only had a year left on my tenure, that I could manage to do both. Of course, remember that I managed to have a full-time job, have 2 children, be the victims champion and be a councillor before, so I can manage it now.
Well, thank you for clarifying that matter. So we then have you selected, I think, in 2013, so almost a year after, or 18 months after you have become a councillor.
Yeah.
You move very, very firmly up the pecking order and become
I'm sure my local council colleagues wouldn't see it that way.
I think they would see it very much that way. Did somebody approach you and say, we want you to fight John Hemmings, or did you always have an eye on being selected? When was the decision made in your own mind, hold it, I am a councillor, but now I've decided I'm going to do something else as well. I want to actually move up a gear, assuming we think that being an MP is moving up a gear.
Exactly, I think that's...
because, I mean, you've interestingly enough said, in fact, I actually had more power as a senior manager in Women's Aid and as a councillor than I do as an MP.
Yeah.
So
that's definitely true, and I think that's the hierarchy is interestingly not based on power and change, it is based on titles. And I think that's regrettable, actually, and we should celebrate our council colleagues much more than we do. And understand local government, and I think having an understanding of local government in the Commons actually has been really helpful, especially when local government faces such challenges. But yes, I suppose the way it seems is that I move up the pecking order. I actually think I decided I wanted to be a Member of Parliament before I was a councillor, and actually I wasn't asked to go for the seat in Yardley. I had always wanted to be the representative here ever since I'd got back involved in politics, because, like I said, this is where all of my family come from, and I like a challenge, and John Hemming presented me with a challenge, but I was asked to become the councillor in Longbridge. That's the way around it goes.
Right.
So they didn't feel that there were many candidates on the panel for Labour Party candidates, so I was asked if I would stand for council election.
Right. You said a couple of things which are interesting. which I don't want to put to you, just about, first of all, you said, I am too overconfident, and here in Parliament, that's a bit naive. Of course, it's a facade. I think that was an interview with the Huffington Post. Do you think that is the case? Is Jess Phillips too overconfident, or and is it a facade, or is the Jess Phillips that we hear on interviews the real Jess Phillips, or is there a deep cerebral Jess Phillips elsewhere that perhaps we're waiting to discover?
No, I'm not sure that she's in there, the deep cerebral. I think that when I say that it's a facade, what I think people see me as being a bit of a battler, willing to stand up and speak, and those things are all completely true. I am incredibly confident, and I recognise that how that can come across sometimes. I don't ever walk away from things when sometimes I should, and I no doubt will learn it. I definitely have got better over the years, so maybe I'll become much more sedate over the next 10 years. Who knows? But the saying that it's a facade is more, I think, to say that I am not just a fighter, that these things, they hurt me deeply, and actually I've cried in the Commons chamber and the chamber on Birmingham City Council on numerous occasions. I don't make that quite so public because some of the things we are discussing are incredibly hard, and I don't feel like I can fight. I just feel hopeless sometimes, or very moved by things sometimes. But yeah, I think that the facade, I think that anyone who came in here and saw me with my constituents doing casework would never walk away thinking that I was some sort of fighter who shouts out in Parliament. They would think that I was, I don't know, I'm like a teddy bear to the people in here. We have this running joke that I give a cuddle to everybody who comes through the door. And I know how to communicate with people who are very, very, very distressed in a sort of completely soft way. And I think that maybe that doesn't come across when you see me talking in Parliament.
Okay, well, I wonder if I could discuss with you the use of language. Because language of various kinds figures quite a lot in what you have said. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know whether you choose deliberately to use certain types of language, but it's interesting in a politician who is happy to repeat certain things again. And I'll come back to now, which we can refer to, the Julie Burchill interview, which you had, mm-hmm. and of course the Helen Pidd interview in The Guardian. In both of those, you did not recoil from the fact that in a public meeting, not in a public meeting, in a private meeting, but with other members of the Labour Party, you told Diane Abbott to fuck off.
Yeah.
And you to be fair, you make
it sound like a big public meeting. There was only 3 people who would have heard it, and I was one of them.
Well, thank you for clarifying that.
It wasn't like standing in front of swathes of people. It was at the end of a meeting.
Thank you for putting the record because that is very much what is actually clear. It doesn't come clear from the Guardian article, and it certainly doesn't come clear from your interview with Julie Burchill. Mm-hmm. But you do accept. I
didn't talk to Julie Burchill about it at all. I don't think. I mean, maybe briefly, but and the bit that where she talks about that incident is not part of the interview. You might notice in Julie Burchill's piece, it's part of the pre-blur.
Yes, it's part of what she asserts, but you're clarifying just for the record and just speaking to Labour Lives now that in fact it was 3 people who heard this.
Me, Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott.
And you were, and the context is you were making a criticism about the fact that women weren't being promoted in the Labour Party or offered jobs.
I had made that criticism in the full public meeting. I stood up and I made that criticism in the full public meeting of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Right. And then the meeting, about an hour later when the meeting had finished, so I was the first contributor in the meeting, so an hour later when the meeting had finished, Jeremy Corbyn had just been elected as the leader of the Labour Party. I'd never, in fact, in the opening of my speech about how disappointed I was, I said, "Hello, Jeremy, I'm Jess, we've never met." So I'm criticising a man I've never met for his actions. And then so at the end of the meeting, because I was brought up properly and I'm not just a warrior, I'm a nice person, I approached the plinth where the leader and the shadow cabinet sit. So everybody's walking out of the room, hubbub is happening. And I approached where Jeremy Corbyn is sitting. He's talking to somebody else, and I wait to talk to him at the end of a meeting. And I started to talk to him, and I was saying, I hope you don't think I was being rude. I think we've got to address this. I don't intend to be rude. And I was trying to tell him I would work with him in making this better, and he just literally started to say to me, I learnt my mum was a real feminist, and was saying some really charming things about his mum to me. And at that moment, Diane Abbott came over to our private conversation and started having a go at me. It's quite a different thing to me standing up in a meeting.
It's a wholly different thing, and forgive me if I've got it wrong, but can you understand now that so many people reading those articles will now have this view that you effectively stood in a private meeting of the Labour Party, the PLP, and told a senior member of the party to fuck off? Though you did say in the Guardian article that she did, quotes, fuck off.
Exactly. It's because we weren't in the middle of a meeting. We were at the point when everybody's walking out of the meeting. It would have been weird if she just got up and walked out of the meeting on my instruction.
But which I'm perhaps labouring a little bit too much, is that later on you make reference to your maiden speech and references to first time I've been called a maiden. You refer to the woman deputy speaker as Ms deputy speaker. You describe yourself as an angry feminist, and people should shout out and use the sort of Caitlin Moran phrase, "I am a feminist." But you then refer to some older women as little old ladies. Now, some people might find being termed as a little old lady offensive.
True,
do you agree that language is something that perhaps politicians have got to be careful about, and perhaps you should temper that, or you just think that's part of the personality that Jess Phillips is?
Unfortunately, I mean, if I ever offend anyone, and saying little old ladies, I use the terminology, I said, after I'd said that and somebody criticised me for saying it, I completely, without knowing, the other day referred to myself as little old me, and then I thought, I don't intend it to be offensive, but if there are specific things that I say that offend people, there's no doubt that I will temper them in future terminology. But to be perfectly honest, it's not. I mean, if people are offended, then they are offended, and I should temper my language. However, the only reason I mention it is because you hold a great office. Still, to be an MP is still something that most people think is an amazing thing, and I still have people have a great. Most people have a fine respect of them when they meet MPs on a personal basis. The public may. No, the public may have a general view that they're all down there looking after themselves, snouts in the trough and all that sort of stuff. But I think when people who you meet, your constituents, suddenly meet Jess Phillips, they know that they're dealing with a totally different person and a different way of, a different individual is what I'm saying. So, in a way, isn't the minute you became an MP the minute you had to change some of it? Or you think that would be putting too much of the facade up? I think it would be dishonest, is the truth. I think that there are many reasons that drove me to want to being in Parliament. Some of them about Yardley and how I felt I didn't feel as somebody who comes from this area proud of the person who was representing it, and some of it and how I feel it's been a bit forgotten and actually needs someone to stand up for it. The other things are obviously issues-based, specifically around domestic violence, sexual violence, vulnerable children and women, and autistic children. the big issues that I hope to be able to do something about while I'm in there. But the single biggest driver for me wanting to be a Member of Parliament anywhere is to try and make Parliament, to do something to try and make it be about the people out here, not the people in there. And I could speak like everybody else speaks, and I could probably temper myself, and I could deliver the lines, but I don't think people have any faith in that anymore. I don't think people find that approachable anymore. I don't wish to be on a pedestal because I've got fancy letters before or after my name. I don't like it, the fact that the reverence for MPs. I don't like it, and I don't think they should be treated badly because they are elected representatives and they stood for office, nor should they be treated any better because of that reason. And I don't like it when somebody will come in here, an elderly person will come in and they can't get their boiler fixed, and they've been sat in a cold house for 2 weeks, and they come in here or ring me, and we ring up the council, and then their boiler is fixed. Why is my voice any more important than the little old lady who sat in the blinking cold? It should be her they're listening to. And actually, I don't have some grand plan to humanise Parliament, but I do. What really drives me is I want it to be about people out here, not people in there. A constituent of mine came up to me last night. I was at a carol, Sheldon community carol service, and 3 different primary schools were there, and all their parents were there, and a mum came up to me. A mum I was there with my kids, her kids were about the same age as me. A mum came up to me and she felt she could just walk straight up to me, and she said to me, "Oh, I want to thank you for the way that you voted on the Syria thing." And then she leant in and whispered in my ear. Her children were with her and my children were with me, and she whispered in my ear, she said, you can, if you ever need any help with those fucking bastards on the internet, let me know. And I don't think she would have said that to somebody who hadn't spoken like I have. These are the people who I represent. And maybe if you want real people in Parliament, you have to sometimes expect them to be a bit real.
Well, Jess Phillips, thank you for speaking to Labour Lives. I hope that this interview will mean that I have spoken to maybe not the next leader of the Labour Party, but the next but one. And I await developments. And I will hold you to an interview in the future if you hold high office in due course. Thank you very much for speaking to Labour Lives.
You're welcome.